Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of those stories that makes you pull the blanket a little higher and maybe check the lock on your door one more time. You drift into a dim, medieval village where the rain never seems to stop and the wind rattles the shutters like impatient fingers. Everyone around you whispers of a father who vanished with his own daughter. A crime that even in an age of plague, famine, and endless wars felt like a nightmare beyond the ordinary. You probably won't survive this if you're squeamish about old world justice. But that's half the fun, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because you might fall asleep during this story and share only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'm always amazed by how many of you are nodding off in different corners of the world. Now, turn off the lights and lie down on your chair or bed, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You step out onto a muddy medieval lane, boots squelching, the stench of damp straw mixing with smoke from low-burning hearths. It's late, past the hour when peasants retreat indoors, but a gathering knot of figures stands in the square, their breath clouding the misty air. The bell in the church tower is tolling, slow, deliberate, the kind of sound reserved not for fire or invasion, but for scandal. Tonight, the scandal is whispered through trembling lips. A father has abducted his own child. The notion alone makes you shiver. In a world where fathers were supposed to be stern guardians of the household, charged by law, custom, and the church to protect their offspring, this crime lands like a dagger in the heart of the community. And yet, here it is, recounted in frightened voices as the villagers cluster together for safety. You can almost taste the fear, metallic and heavy, hanging in the mist. Your ears catch fragments. "He took her at dusk," someone mutters. "Didn't even pack food." Another adds, "Historians still argue whether it was madness, greed, or something darker that drove him." That phrase gives you a sense of how slippery the past is. Stories mutate, motives blur. Even in the Middle Ages, people argued over what pushed a man across the line of reason. You trudge closer to the square, taking in the tiny half-timbered homes sagging under centuries of rain, their thatched roofs dripping like wet hair. The only light comes from tallow candles sputtering in horn lanterns. The sheriff of the manor, little more than a farmer with a badge, raises a hand and barks, "Quiet!" His voice is thin against the church bell's echo, but the people hush. Everyone's gaze swings toward him, like frightened birds following a hawk. It's worth remembering that in this period, crimes like theft, arson, and even accidental insult could bring harsh punishments. Stocks, whippings, fines paid in grain or hens. All were common. But abduction by a father? That slams into the community's deepest taboos. You glance at the sheriff's furrowed brow and know that even he, a man used to chasing runaway pigs more than criminals, feels overwhelmed. Your mind drifts for a moment into the odd, quirky details of medieval crime fighting. Did you know, for instance, that some villages still believed in trial by hot iron? If the accused could carry a glowing bar across the church floor without blistering, it proved innocence. Talk about a tough justice system. You picture the father, if caught, being forced into such a trial, his guilt determined not by evidence, but by the condition of his skin. Creepy, sure, but that was the world you're walking in tonight. The crowd stirs again. A young woman, clutching her apron, whispers that she saw the girl near the mill the day before, feeding geese. The memory brings a pang. The daughter was woven into the community's daily rhythm, and now that thread has been violently pulled out. People are already speculating where they might have gone. Into the forest? Toward the marshes? Maybe even to the road that leads to the distant walled city, where anonymity swallows faces. You wrap your cloak tighter, feeling the chill settle into your bones. This isn't just gossip. It's the unfolding of a communal trauma. Everyone is forced to confront the reality that the walls of family, supposedly sacred, can crack. You glance at the villagers, their expressions ranging from rage to sorrow, and you wonder which will win out when the father is found. Some older men mutter about God's punishment, while the priest himself paces near the church steps, muttering Latin prayers under his breath. He insists that the sin is double. Not only the crime against the daughter, but the stain upon the village's collective soul. In the medieval worldview, disasters were contagious. One man's sin could draw down plague or famine upon all. That's a heavy burden, and you sense why the bell tolls. This isn't just about one family. You notice a boy sneaking closer to listen, his hair sticking to his forehead with rain. He tugs at your sleeve and whispers, "They say he carried a bundle. Some think it was food, some think it was rope." His wide eyes dart around as if the father might leap out of the shadows at any moment. That detail gnaws at you. Bundle, rope, food, signs of preparation. Was this planned? Historians still argue whether medieval criminals like him plotted carefully or acted in sudden frenzy. Maybe it was both. The sheriff announces a search at dawn, though you know sleep will evade many tonight. Mothers clutch their children closer. Fathers lock doors, though bolts of wood would hardly stop a determined intruder. You find yourself gazing into the dark lanes, leading away from the village, each one a potential path of escape. Somewhere out there, a father walks with his daughter, his motives tangled in secrecy. A stray dog shakes itself by the well, water spraying from its matted fur, and the crowd jumps as if the animal were an omen. Medieval people read signs into everything. Comets, broken eggs, even the direction smoke drifted. You catch yourself wondering if this dog's sudden arrival will be recounted in chronicles as proof of fate. That's the kind of quirky tidbit that would survive for centuries while the girl's actual voice might vanish. And as you stand there, surrounded by the anxiety of a community, you feel the story digging into you. The night is only beginning, and with it, a tale that will twist through alleys of fear, belief, and strange justice. You take one last look at the bell tower silhouetted against the moon, and then your feet begin to follow the path out of the square after the whispers of a vanished child. You shuffle forward down the muddy lane, dawn only a pale smear on the horizon. The mist clings to your hair, and the village stirs reluctantly to life. Chickens squawk as they're freed from their coops, and the smell of damp rye bread baking seeps from a hearth somewhere nearby. Ordinary life continues, but you sense the tension that clings to everyone like soot after a fire. Daily life in the Middle Ages was hard enough, without the added fear of betrayal inside one's own household. You pass a woman drawing water from the communal well. She looks over her shoulder before whispering to you, "You know, this isn't the first time we've seen families torn apart. Hunger makes men do strange things." Her words stick because she's right. Most people in this age lived on the edge of famine. Crops failed, winters were cruel, and lords demanded taxes whether fields yielded grain or only weeds. A father's desperation could twist into something unrecognizable. Historians still argue whether most medieval crimes sprouted from pure malice or the gnawing pangs of poverty. As you trudge past crooked houses, you take in their small details. Rough wattle and daub walls, patched with whatever could be scavenged. Roofs layered with thatch so thick it drips endlessly after rain. Inside, entire families huddled in one smoky room, with animals sometimes sharing the floor. Privacy barely existed. Imagine a world where you could hear your neighbor sneeze and smell his dinner through thin walls. Jokes about modern apartments being cramped don't sound so funny anymore. Your stomach flips as you catch the scent of salted fish drying on racks. It's a reminder that medieval villagers relied on a monotonous diet. Bread, pottage, maybe a scrap of cheese, and if you were lucky, a bit of meat on feast days. You wonder, if this father carried off food in that mysterious bundle, was he planning to keep his daughter alive while fleeing? Or was it bait for the long road ahead? You duck into the tavern, already humming with talk despite the early hour. Taverns weren't just drinking holes. They were the medieval news networks. Inside, you're greeted by the sour tang of ale and the chatter of villagers replaying every rumor. One old man, cheeks flushed, slams his cup on the table and declares, "Mark me, this will end like the tale of the baker's son." People lean in, eager for drama. Apparently, in a nearby village years ago, a man disappeared with his kin and was found weeks later in a cave, half-starved. Whether true or embroidered, such stories spread like wildfire. A quirky detail catches your ear. A traveling merchant recalls seeing the missing father earlier in the week, bargaining fiercely over a single candle. Why haggle over light when days were lengthening? Perhaps he meant to walk by night. The thought gnaws at you. This wasn't random. Every scrap of gossip paints a picture of a man preparing for something. The tavern's hearth spits, filling the room with warmth and smoke. As you sit on a rough bench, you can't help but notice the carved graffiti in the wood. Rude drawings, initials, even a crude cross. It reminds you that even in an age so controlled by church and lord, people still left their marks in small, rebellious ways. Maybe the daughter once etched something similar in her home, now abandoned. The innkeeper leans close, lowering his voice. Some say the girl resisted. Others say she followed willingly. His eyes dart, measuring your reaction. The room shifts as villagers debate loudly. Was she dragged? Was she persuaded? Was it a plan, hatched by both? Historians still argue whether medieval women and girls had any agency in these situations, or if later chroniclers projected their own assumptions. In truth, you realize we may never know. Stepping outside again, the sun struggles through the cloud, casting weak light across fields stretching beyond the village. Farmers bend to their plows, oxen groaning as they pull wooden beams through sticky earth. The ordinariness of it stings. You're surrounded by routine, while one family's nightmare has unraveled in plain sight. In medieval society, though, disruptions were never private. Everyone felt them. A single theft, a single scandal could redefine the rhythm of an entire community. You glance toward the church, its squat stone walls dark against the sky. A woman kneels outside, clutching a rosary of carved bone beads, lips moving swiftly in prayer. Her whispers mingle with the distant clang of blacksmiths striking iron. The spiritual and the mundane always interwove here. Sin was not an individual affair. It was thought to invite divine punishment on crops, weather, even livestock. The missing daughter wasn't only a family matter. She was a spiritual hazard. As you wander, you stumble upon the village green where children play a rough game with sticks and a ball of rags. Their laughter seems wrong in the wake of the abduction, yet it's also a reminder of resilience. Even in dark times, life demanded to go on. One child shouts, "We'll find her in the woods." It's a game to them, but you hear the echo of adult fears. In the distance, a horn sounds. The call of the reeve, organizing search parties. People gather with spears, pitchforks, even kitchen knives tied to poles. This wasn't a professional constabulary. It was neighborly vigilance. You're struck by how collective justice worked in this era. A crime wasn't solved by a detective with a magnifying glass. It was hunted down by neighbors with lanterns. You step closer to the group, forming near the edge of the forest. A boy ties a piece of cloth around his head like a bandit, grinning despite the grim errand. "If we find them, we'll drag him to the manor," he boasts. His bravado makes the older men scowl. Everyone knows punishment will be harsh, but catching the father in the first place is the real challenge. The mist thickens as the villagers step forward, and you move with them, boots sucking at mud. Birds scatter from the tree line. Every snapped twig raises nerves. Somewhere, hidden in these woods, or farther down the road, a father and daughter are carving out their strange, secret path. And you, carried along by the tide of ordinary people, feel the weight of medieval daily life pressing in. Grain fields, church bells, gossip, hunger, all woven into the fabric of one terrible disappearance. You glance back once more at the village, smoke curling from chimneys like watchful eyes. It strikes you that medieval life was a constant tug of war between routine and rupture. One moment, you're baking bread and complaining about the cost of candles. The next, you're searching forests for a neighbor who has shattered the deepest taboo. And so, with the taste of damp air in your mouth and the weight of dread in your chest, you keep moving forward. You move with the searchers to the edge of the trees, but the reeve waves you back toward the square. "We need memories before we need muscles," he says, a medieval version of "let's crowdsource this." And so you drift door to door, lantern to lantern, gathering little pieces of the man who has become a rumor with legs. Neighbors talk in low tones, as if the mere act of speaking his name could open a crack in the air and let him step through. At the cooper's shed, sawdust feathering your boots, a barrel maker wipes his hands and frowns at the floorboards. "Hard worker," he says. "If a cart broke, he'd shoulder the load himself. I saw him lift planks 2 men grunted over." The cooper doesn't meet your eyes, but he stared too long at distances, as if the horizon owed him something. You let that hang. Work builds reputations. Stairs build stories. Across the lane, the miller leans against the doorway where flour dust turns his eyebrows white. He brought grain at odd hours, the miller murmurs. Preferred moonlight. Said the road was cooler then. You recall the gossip about a single candle fiercely bargained for. The nocturnal habit fits like a peg in a hoop. The miller adds, kept his accounts neat, paid on the nose, not stingy, not generous, just exact. In a tight village economy where favors oil the gears, exactness can be a kind of loneliness. The alewife remembers him for something even smaller. He drank the weak ale, never the strong, and counted his pennies by touching each coin to his lip before dropping it into her palm. Said he could taste bad metal. She laughs uneasily. People in the room nod. In a world before banknotes, your mouth is as good as a money tester. You make a note of the quirky superstition that floats up from this. Some folk keep a toadstone ring, really a fossil fish tooth, to detect poison in drink. He didn't own such a ring, the alewife says. He trusted his senses. The kind of man who insists on proving the world himself. At the smithy, where iron sings like caged thunder, the blacksmith rubs a thumb along an anvil's edge. Quiet man, the smith says. Didn't haggle unless he felt cheated. Then his eyes went cold, like pond ice in February. You picture it. Hard work, hard gaze, hard lines. If medieval life were a series of woodcuts, his would be heavy on the cross-hatching. You get a different angle at the church porch. A woman, whose brother once hired the father to fell timber, leans in. He made the sign of the cross left-handed, she whispers, as if that detail alone explains the night. You almost smile. Left-handers have always been suspicious novelties. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed left-handedness marked character, or whether later storytellers added that seasoning, you murmur to yourself, keeping your voice soft. Either way, oddities grow antlers when fear is loose. A boy with hay sticking from his sleeves darts up. He could tell the weather by sheep, the boy says, dead serious. Said if the sheep huddle, rain. If they wander, clear. You nod because, frankly, the sheep are probably more accurate than your last weather app. That gentle joke earns the boy a grin he didn't know he was waiting for, and you tuck the tidbit away with the candle and the coin lips, a pattern of a man who reads signs and numbers like scripture. Near the common oven, the baker pauses, palms dusted with flour. He was punctual, she says. Punctuality is kindness in a village. Then, after a breath, but not patient, she tells you how he once snapped when the line bunched, muttering that hours are rungs on a ladder and I am climbing. It's a strange image for a peasant, upward, upward, like someone who kept a private staircase in his mind. The joke that wants to rise. No elevator in this parish. You swallow it to a hum, keeping your tone low and lulling. The priest meets you under the eaves, rain trickling from the roof in thin ropes. He weighs his words as if they might blow away. He confessed irregularly, the priest says, which is medieval for he skipped spiritual maintenance. When he came, he spoke of anger, of debts, and of a house divided. You ask if the priest means family quarrels. The priest lifts one palm. A father commands his house, yes, but consent matters. That is your mainstream fact weaving gently through the dusk. By the 12th century, canon law crystallized the idea that a valid marriage required the consent of both parties, bride and groom. However harsh the patriarchal world, the Church's doctrinal line on consent is real and paradoxically fragile in practice. Historians still argue whether that consent operated as meaningful protection for women and girls, or as words that communities stretched over their own preferences like a thin blanket. You don't push the priest, but you can feel the trace of something. Arguments about a future betrothal, a rumor that the girl would be pledged to a neighboring farm in exchange for remitting a stubborn debt. Village life turns on such hinges. The difference between guardianship and kidnapping can be a single night and an unlocked door. In medieval legal Latin, a single term, raptus, could blur abduction and other crimes into the same ink blot. That ambiguity isn't just a scholar's puzzle. It's a lived danger. Down by the stream, two older men sit with fishing lines, which is to say, they're conducting serious civic analysis. He helped at harvest, one says, rolling a pebble between his fingers. Never drank past cents. The other nods. But he held grudges like a miser holds candles. There's your callback. The candle he haggled for. Light you have to buy. By the inch encourages a certain accounting soul. You picture him pacing the dark lane, candle-cupped, counting steps. You gather whispers of domestic scenes that don't cross the line of our story, but shape the silhouette. He corrected in a voice that was too steady. He prized obedience as tidiness of the soul. He disliked the new songs the village boys sang at the tavern. On market days, he walked with a tuned slowness, as if anything spontaneous were a trap door. People like that keep their worlds from wobbling by tightening every screw they can reach. When something resists, like a daughter who laughs where silence is preferred, their hands flex toward rope and road. On the edge of the green, you join a small knot of men bound together in a frank pledge. Those 10 or so neighbor groups responsible for each other's behavior. That's another solid historical fact. In much of medieval England, at least, men over a certain age were sorted into tithings, mutually answerable for one another, obliged to raise the hue and cry if someone misbehaved. If your buddy stole a pig, you were suddenly very interested in pig law. We vouched for him at court 2 winters ago, one man tells you. A fence dispute, he spoke slowly, like each word had to pass inspection. The memory makes him wince. I thought slowness meant honesty. Perhaps it meant calculation. Historians still argue whether rural communities misread taciturn men as reliable, or whether our sources, biased by clerks who loved tidy morality plays, just make it look that way. The reeve returns from the tree line, wet to the knees, and asks what you've gathered. You give him the portrait. Strong back, late night habits, exact change, a mind that treats time like stacked firewood, and a simmering dislike of disorder. The reeve nods grimly. A man who plans, he says, a man who drills a hole through a coin to string it safe. You blink. Did he really do that? The reeve shrugs. So I've heard. A fringe tidbit, perhaps exaggerated, but not impossible. People secured precious things however they could. A breeze lifts the thatch above you like the pelt of some patient animal. Far off, the church bell gives a single note, a reminder that the day is moving, whether you are ready or not. 3 small jokes flicker in your mind like hearth sparks. No, medieval HR department to file complaints with, an employee review conducted by the blacksmith's eyebrow, and the toadstone as early poison detector R&D team. But you let them out as whispers, warm and brief, so they don't jar the weary air. If only the parish had HR, you murmur. The smith's side-eye would have him on a performance plan. And imagine wearing a ring that complains every time ale is sketchy. Half the tavern would shut. When the reeve asks for anything else, you add the last part neighbors kept circling. He loved that girl, several said, almost defensively, then went still, as if the words themselves were sharp. Love is not the same as goodness. In a world of tight ropes and tighter rules, love can turn into possession, and possession can turn a road into a cage. You hear, again, the baker's phrase, hours like rungs, and you feel a chill at the idea of a man climbing somewhere nobody else can follow. You step back toward the green, where searchers gather again with spears, crooks, and a couple of kitchen knives that were never meant for anything but bread. The portrait of the father, painstakingly sketched by a dozen ordinary voices, hovers beside you like breath in the cold. Hard-working, exact, watchful, a gaze like February ice. If you want to find such a man, you look not for footprints alone, but for places where the world lines up too neatly, where someone has counted the distances and chosen the darkest mile. The forest presses in around you, branches dripping yesterday's rain onto your shoulders as you follow the faint traces the villagers insist belong to the father and daughter. Yet even as the path darkens, your mind drifts back toward the girl herself, the one who has suddenly become a ghost in her own community. You need to picture her world before it vanished, because that world was textured, ordinary, and painfully fragile. Her life, like most girls in the Middle Ages, revolved around chores from dawn until dusk. You imagine her barefoot in the yard, scattering grain for chickens, her fingers raw from hauling water buckets heavier than her arms should bear. A wool dress, patched at the elbows, would be her uniform. Linen shifts beneath were washed rarely, for water was precious and soap expensive. A braided cord might serve as her belt, and in colder months she'd wear a sheepskin mantle that smelled perpetually of lanolin. This is not the world of knights in shining armor. It's the world of aching backs and muddy hems. You step carefully over a tree root and think about how a girl of her age might dream. Songs sung by traveling minstrels hinted at faraway places, castles, seas, golden cities. Yet the likely horizon for her life was another cottage, another plowed strip of land, another round of children to tend. A local betrothal would have been arranged, sealed not by her voice but by the shaking of hands between fathers. Historians still argue whether daughters truly had any say in these agreements, or if the rare records of protest reflect unusual courage rather than common practice. Imagine her waking the morning before the disappearance. She'd stir embers in the hearth, blowing on them to coax a flame, her breath tasting of smoke. She might mash oats for breakfast pottage, stir in a few wild herbs, then help mend fishing nets with knotted fingers. The rhythm of her day was carved by seasons: lambing in spring, harvest in autumn, spinning in winter. Each task bound her to the community until suddenly, brutally, she was torn from it. One quirky tidbit comes to mind. Many medieval girls learned not just household skills, but also how to keep bees. Honey was a prized sweetener, and beeswax essential for candles in churches and homes alike. Perhaps she tended a small hive near her cottage, watching the bees wheel against the sky. If so, the absence of her quiet figure before the hives would have been one of the first things neighbors noticed, a silence louder than any rumor. The villagers who recall her describe someone quick to smile, the kind of girl who'd help an old woman carry sticks or sing while gathering rushes for floor covering. In such a tight-knit place, everyone knew everyone else's songs and silences. That is why her vanishing strikes harder than a failed crop. A stolen daughter is not just a family wound, it's a hole punched in the entire tapestry of the village. You picture her walking with her father as he led her away. Was she struggling, or resigned, or clinging to hope he meant only a short journey? Did she believe promises of a better life, perhaps spun from fragments of stories overheard at fairs? Historians still argue whether abducted daughters in medieval records were always unwilling, or whether chroniclers simplified complex choices into the neat label of victim. The truth is messy, and your steps through the mud feel messy too. Back in the village, her absence would ripple through ordinary chores. A younger sibling suddenly had to tend goats. A mother sat longer by the fire, spinning wool in silence. Friends avoided the cottage altogether, as if proximity to shame could stain them. Medieval people often believed misfortune was contagious, and a girl taken from her home might be spoken of in whispers, as though her shadow carried ill luck. You crouch beside the faint outline of a footprint in the damp earth, small, lighter than the father's. It looks like she stumbled here, the impression of her toes deeper than the heel. You brush the leaves aside and wonder, did she hesitate? Did she glance back toward the smoke of her village curling above the fields? The image sticks like a splinter. The reeve mutters behind you that she'd been promised in betrothal next spring to a farmer's son. That would have been a common path. A dowry of linen, a chest, maybe a goat or two, exchanged to cement family ties. Now, the promise lies shattered. And promises, in this world, are currency more valuable than coins. Break one, and neighbors talk for decades. Your ears catch birdsong above, thrushes trilling, sparrows squabbling. For a moment, nature insists on its own rhythm, indifferent to human scandal. You let the sound wrap around you, gentle and mocking. In her old life, she would have heard the same chorus each morning while hanging laundry or gathering herbs. The same world, the same sounds. Only the context has shifted from routine to captivity. And here's another odd tidbit. Medieval girls often carried charms against bad luck. A knotted string, a bone bead, a sprig of rosemary sewn into clothing. If she carried such a charm, did she clutch it now, fingers sore against its shape? Did she believe it might ward off whatever path her father dragged her down? That small, fragile faith lingers in your mind as you rise and follow the trail deeper. The sun pushes higher, and searchers fan out with shouts and whistles. You step through ferns slick with dew, your cloak snagging on brambles. Every snapped twig feels louder than it should, every rustle of leaves a possible signal. You are not just walking through trees, you are walking through her absence, her world interrupted, her chores abandoned mid-thread. And as you follow, you realize something stark. The story of a vanished daughter is not only about crime, but about what it steals from the ordinary. A missing girl means missing laughter at the well, missing hands at the harvest, missing voice in church hymns. She is not just one life, but a keystone pulled from an arch. Without it, stones shift, the arch trembles, the whole village feels smaller, colder, so you press forward. The image of her daily world burned behind your eyes. The geese at the mill pond, the smell of beeswax candles, the scrape of water buckets. Each detail a reminder of what was, and of the yawning hollow left when what was is ripped away. You keep moving along the woodland path until the sound of voices drifts back toward you. Not the stern call of the reeve or the nervous cries of searchers, but the lilting gossip of villagers still huddled in the tavern, weaving the absence into a tapestry of stories. You slip back toward the square, the mud drying on your boots, and soon enough, the doorway of the alehouse yawns like a hungry mouth. Inside, the air is thick with smoke and fermenting grain, and the rumor mill is already grinding harder than the real one down by the stream. A crooked bench creaks beneath you as you take a seat. Around you, men and women lean on their cups, eyes flashing with half-believed tales. "I heard he planned it for months," one insists, slamming his palm for emphasis. Another shakes his head. No, it was sudden madness. He was seen smiling too wide at the fair, as if a fever had entered him. You listen quietly, because gossip is half truth, half invention. And sometimes the invention is more revealing. One old man, hair wild as straw, begins a story about a baker in the next county who once locked his children in the oven house to keep them from being taken by debt collectors. His neighbors gasp and cross themselves, though you can't help thinking the tale has been kneaded and baked a few times too many. Medieval taverns were like today's online forums, facts and fancies brewed together until nobody could remember which was which. Historians still argue whether we should treat these communal stories as evidence of real crimes or simply as cultural parables, cautionary tales told between gulps of ale. You nurse a cup of the weak stuff, the kind almost safer than water, and your tongue curls at the sourness. A farmer beside you mutters, "He bought rope last week, asked for a length too long for chores." The rumor slides across the table like spilled beer. Rope could mean anything: binding goods on a cart, repairing thatch, or something darker. You make a mental note. Villagers are quick to fit stray purchases into ominous patterns once fear is loose. Another woman leans in and eyes sharp. "He was seen speaking with a merchant from the city, paid him in coin, heavy coin. No farmer keeps that much unless he means to bribe his way somewhere." You notice the shift. Suddenly, the story isn't about a man fleeing into the woods, but about one buying his way into anonymity among city crowds. The gossip mutates faster than smoke in the rafters. You recall a quirky tidbit. Medieval taverns often doubled as post offices. Merchants, messengers, and wandering friars swapped news here. A man could vanish into rumor almost as easily as into forest. If the father truly had a plan, maybe he planted hints in taverns far away, shaping his own myth to confuse pursuers. Or maybe the villagers are inventing genius, where there was only desperation. Historians still argue whether medieval criminals were cunning strategists or just lucky fools until luck ran dry. Your benchmate chuckles and tells a joke to lighten the tension. Maybe he's joined Robin Hood. Laughter ripples, quick and nervous. You smirk too, because even in the Middle Ages, people used humor to frame fear. It's easier to imagine an outlaw ballad than a grim reality. In fact, minstrels often turned grim crimes into verses, softening horror with rhyme. Perhaps already a wandering singer is tuning a lute, preparing to transform this abduction into a warning ballad for another village. As the tavern warms, tongues loosen. A blacksmith insists he heard dogs barking by the mill pond the night of the disappearance, though others swear the dogs were silent, a bad omen. The contradiction doesn't matter. Both details stick. Medieval people believed silence could be as supernatural a sign as noise. Remember the toadstone ring you heard about earlier? This is the same world, where omens cling to ordinary events like burrs on wool. You step back outside into fresher air, your ears buzzing with overlapping tales. Gossip is a kind of fog. It thickens the more people breathe into it, until you can't see the road clearly. Yet it also keeps the village knitted together, turning fear into shared performance. You wonder how the daughter's story will be remembered after the father is caught. Will she be pitied, and suspected, or erased altogether? The shape of gossip often decides. Children chase each other around the square, repeating the fragments they've overheard. He had a rope. He had a candle, they shout, turning tragedy into playground theater. It's eerie, but it's also how memory survives. In centuries to come, scholars might find only scraps of records, but the echoes of children's games sometimes carry further than parchment. The reeve emerges from the church, face stern. Enough talk, he growls, though he knows talk will continue long after he's gone. Villagers glance at you, as though you've become the listener-in-chief, the collector of all these voices. You shrug your cloak and turn back toward the road. Gossip may blur fact, but it reveals the community's pulse, suspicion, fear, and the desperate need to make sense of the unthinkable. As dusk seeps back in, the tavern's murmurs linger behind you, woven into the smoke curling upward from its chimney. They follow like shadows, tales of rope, of merchants, of mad smiles, each one both true and false, like footprints that shift in the mud when you look at them too long. And so you keep walking, the weight of whispered stories pressing at your back, reminding you that in the Middle Ages, a crime lived not only in the act itself, but in the endless retellings it spawned. The sun is slinking toward the horizon again when the church bells break into a frantic peal, sharper and faster than the measured tolling you heard on that first night. You glance up at the squat stone tower, where the rope jerks like a panicked limb in the hands of the young sexton. Villagers pour into the square, faces pale in the flickering light of torches. This time, it isn't idle gossip. It's alarm. The priest himself strides forward, robe flapping, eyes blazing as though fire lived behind them. Sin has crossed into our midst, he declares, his voice bouncing against the cold stones. You feel the hairs on your neck rise. In the Middle Ages, the church was not only a spiritual authority, but also the loudest megaphone for communal fear. Crimes like theft or poaching could be settled with fines. Abduction, though, especially of one's own kin, was thundered about from the pulpit as a crime against God himself. The priest jabs his hand skyward. Do not think this is only the Father's shame. If we do not act, pestilence may descend on our fields and our children. You hear murmurs ripple through the crowd, memories of last year's blight, of cows that dropped dead without cause. Medieval minds saw divine punishment in every wilted leaf. Historians still argue whether this was genuine belief or a rhetorical tool priests used to stiffen obedience. Either way, the fear was real, and you feel it thrum in your own ribs. The torches cast jagged halos across faces as villagers cluster tighter. Someone asks whether they should organize another night search. The priest shakes his head. First confession, first prayer. The devil moves by night, and so we must shield ourselves in holy words before our feet chase evil. You can't help thinking wryly that medieval law enforcement often took a back seat to medieval pageantry. Still, when you're told that demons skulk in shadows, you don't argue. You light another candle. A quirky tidbit drifts up from your memory. In many places, church bells were rung not only for worship, but also as protective charms. People believed the vibrations themselves could chase away storms, plague, even spirits. Tonight, the bells hammer so hard you half expect the sky itself to split. You joke under your breath, forget bug spray, just bring a bell, and a nervous chuckle escapes someone nearby. The priest orders a procession. Villagers clutch candles, some carrying icons or wooden crosses, and begin circling the square. Their murmured Latin chants roll over you like a tide, half understood, fully felt. Children stumble sleepily at their mother's skirts, eyes wide with both fear and the thrill of being awake past dark. The glow of flames catches the thatched roofs, turning them into golden crowns above black walls. You move with the line, chanting under your breath, though the words taste foreign. Smoke curls into your eyes, making them water. A woman beside you mutters that the father's crime has already cursed her garden. Her cabbages are wilting. Another insists she heard wolves howling closer than usual. People weave personal misfortunes into the tapestry of sin like beads on a rosary. The priest halts before the church doors and spreads his arms. Until this evil is uprooted, none shall rest easy. His proclamation feels both comforting and threatening. Comforting, because action is being taken. Threatening, because action in this era often meant punishments that rattled your bones just to imagine. Stocks, pillories, whippings, all could be rehearsed in the villagers' minds before the accused was even caught. Historians still argue whether such ceremonies genuinely bound communities together or simply amplified panic. To you, it feels like both. There's a rhythm here, bells, chants, torchlight, that numbs thought and sharpens collective determination. You catch yourself swaying with the chant, as though you've been pulled into the liturgy of suspicion. As the service ends, the priest blesses the assembled with a great sweep of holy water. Drops glitter in the firelight, striking your cloak cold. Children giggle and shiver. Adults cross themselves solemnly. Then the reeve steps forward. "At dawn we ride again," he says. "Tonight we pray, tomorrow we hunt." His voice is blunt, practical, a needed counterpoint to the priest's thunder. You step back into the square as villagers disperse. Some head to taverns for comfort and ale, others to their cottages, where they'll bolt the doors tighter than usual. The church bells fall silent, but the echo still throbs in your ears like a drumbeat you can't escape. You realize that the church has done more than mark the crime. It has turned it into a moral storm cloud hovering over every thatched roof. And in that silence, broken only by the crackle of torches dying down, you understand something chilling. In the Middle Ages, the line between crime and sin was thinner than parchment. To abduct a daughter was not only to fracture a family, but to invite judgment on the entire village. You pull your cloak close, remembering the smell of beeswax, the laughter of gossip, the small footprint in the mud. They all twist together now with the heavy toll of bells and the priest's voice. The night deepens, the air sharp with wood smoke and dread. Somewhere out there, the father and daughter move through darkness. And somewhere here, the community prays louder to drown its own fear. You can feel both worlds pressing against you. The hush of footsteps in forest mud, and the roar of chants in torchlight. And you know they are on a collision course. The night breaks apart into uneasy scraps of sleep, and by the time dawn slides pale across the thatched roofs, you're already trudging beside the search party. Lanterns swing on poles, though their light is feeble now against the gray sky. The reeve walks ahead, boots caked in mud, jaw clenched. Behind him, a gaggle of men clutch whatever they've managed to call weapons, spears dulled from years of disuse, billhooks normally meant for trimming hedges, even a rolling pin brandished by one determined woman. You have to smile softly. If evil really is abroad, it may find the rolling pin the most terrifying. The group fans out across the meadow first, because that's how searches always begin. Start wide, then press into the darker places. Chickens cluck nervously at the sudden commotion, and sheep bleat as villagers barge through. You glance at the fields stretching beyond, still damp from yesterday's rain, furrows etched like ribs into the earth. Somewhere out there, footprints may linger. Though the ground is greedy, it swallows traces quickly. The reeve stoops suddenly, lifting a scrap of cloth snagged on a bramble. A murmur ripples through the crowd. The cloth is plain, unremarkable, but to frightened eyes it becomes proof. Omen and map, all at once. Historians still argue whether medieval search parties truly relied on physical clues, or whether they imposed meaning on any object found along the way. Either way, the villagers gasp as though this rag were a saint's relic. You keep walking, squinting at the ground. The forest edge looms, dark and whispering. Birds scatter from the branches, startled by your approach. One man mutters that the father's footprints looked heavier than usual, as though he carried not just his daughter, but sin itself. His companion retorts that footprints mean nothing, that he might have walked heavier to disguise his path. Even in pursuit, medieval people argued over interpretation. You're reminded, oddly, of modern debates about reading data, though no one here would call it that. The quirky detail of the day comes when the party halts at the stream. A woman kneels to peer into the water and swears she sees the girl's reflection drifting by. The others hush her, half fearful she's glimpsed some supernatural sign. In truth, it's only the ripple of clouds, but you tuck it away as a reminder of how fluidly omen and fact intertwined in this age. Crossing the stream, your boots squelch in the mud. The reeve orders the group to spread farther, calling that the devil hides where men fear to tread. You step deeper into the trees. Ferns brush your knees. The air smells of moss and damp earth, and every creak of a branch feels like it might be the breath of someone watching. The forest is not empty. It carries the weight of countless tales. Wolves, outlaws, spirits. Searching for a missing girl here is not just physical labor. It's psychological warfare against your own imagination. You stumble upon a crude shelter of branches leaning against a fallen oak. The villagers gather, eyes wide. Could this be where he rested? Inside, there are only damp leaves and the bones of a rabbit picked clean. The reeve pokes at it with his spear. Not theirs, he mutters, but the crowd remains hushed. It doesn't matter. In stories they'll tell later, this shelter will become the father's den, proof of his cunning. As you push on, torches are relit, though daylight has come fully. Smoke snakes upward, a comfort against the gloom. One man recalls that in older times, villagers believed torches could repel not just beasts, but unclean spirits. He chuckles darkly. If only flame scared away guilt as easily. That's your joke for the march. Grim, but oddly fitting. The trail grows fainter. Mud hardens. Leaves scatter. And the reeve grumbles that pursuit in daylight is a fool's errand. Yet still they go, driven less by hope of catching than by the ritual of searching. Historians still argue whether such communal hunts were effective or merely symbolic gestures, ways to prove unity even when success was unlikely. You sense both. Each step, each snapped twig, is less about catching one man than about telling each other. We tried. By midday, the group halts in a clearing. Bread is passed around, hard loaves, rough cheese, a flask of ale. You chew slowly, the taste of smoke still clinging to your tongue from the night before. A boy points to the sky where crows circle, and the group stiffens. Crows mean carrion, and carrion means death. But when the reeve marches over, he finds only the remains of a deer left by wolves. Relief washes through the crowd, though uneasily. Omens are hard to shake once glimpsed. You realize how exhausting the rhythm is. Long trudges broken by bursts of rumor and omen. And yet, this is medieval policing. Neighbors in muddy boots, not professional knights in shining mail. The glamour belongs to ballads. The reality is sore feet and blisters. You grin faintly at the thought that the Middle Ages could use a decent search and rescue handbook. Step 1. Don't panic at crows, you murmur, earning a quick laugh from the boy beside you. As the sun dips, the reeve calls a halt. We'll return, he says. He cannot vanish forever. The villagers nod, though their shoulders sag with weariness. You tramp back toward the village, torches guttering low. The forest remains behind you, vast and inscrutable, its secrets unbothered by your intrusion. Somewhere within or beyond, a father and daughter walk on, and as you approach the first sight of thatched roofs, smoke curling into twilight, you realize the search has accomplished something after all. Even if no footprints were found, the act of moving together, of raising voices against silence, binds the community like threads pulled tighter on a loom. Whether or not they catch him soon, the story will continue, fed by bells, by gossip, by hunts through woods that never yield their secrets easily. You don't expect the trail to speak, but it does, quietly, stubbornly. Once you teach yourself to listen, like a hedgerow listens to wind. Back out past the meadow, you angle with a handful of villagers toward the old sunken lane, a holloway scooped by centuries of cartwheels and boot heels. The walls are green with moss and studded with roots like stiffened veins. There, the ground holds footprints longer than the open fields did, and your breath slows as your eyes adjust to reading dirt like a ledger. The first prints are unmistakable. His stride wider, deeper on the left foot, the heel chewed into the clay. He's carrying a load, the reeve murmurs, and heads nod like wheat in a fair wind. You crouch, tracing the edges with a stick. The daughter's steps, when they appear, are light, close to the ditch wall, as if she keeps one shoulder brushing ivy. Sometimes her tracks vanish altogether, and you find them again only where the lane levels. Historians still argue whether fugitives in this period deliberately walk the edges or the stream beds to confuse pursuit, or if the neatness of such tactics is a story searchers like to tell about clever quarry. Either way, you feel the tug of intention in the scuffed earth. 100 paces on, you find the first abandoned thing, a little waxy stub mashed into the mud. Someone mutters, "Candle," and your mind flashes back to the gossip about haggling over light. The stub smells faintly of beeswax, the good kind, more expensive than tallow, and you picture him cupping it, rationing the night an inch at a time. That's a mainstream fact you can taste. Churches prized beeswax for clean flame, and households cherished any crumb of it. A man who carried such a stub wasn't wandering. He was budgeting darkness. You almost whisper a joke about medieval battery life, but keep it soft enough to float away like smoke. Near an ash tree whose roots splay like fingers, the wall of the holloway breaks for a cart pull-off, and there you find a second clue, a split stick, neatly notched. The baker squints. "Tally," she says, "from the mill or a moneylender?" In these parts, notches on a split tally kept accounts honest. Master and client each held a half, and the notches only lined up for the true pair. The one you hold shows fresh cuts, 3 long, 1 short. Debt or grain, motive or accident. Historians still argue whether notched tallies in stories like this reveal real obligations that drive crimes, or whether later tellers sprinkled them in like seasoning to make motives look tidy. Still, the sight of it warms your suspicion. A man counting candles and notches keeps ledgers in his head. The reeve fishes something from a bramble, a ribbon, more cord than adornment, with a knot tied oddly, twice forward, once back. A woman at your shoulder breathes. That's her knot. Her mother taught her, she says. The girl tied bundles so they'd never slip. You roll it between finger and thumb, feeling the slight grit of ash, and store the pattern in your pocket memory. If she tied this and dropped it, was it a marker, a plea, or the accidental shedding of a life being stripped to essentials? Beyond the ash, the lane dips and bleeds into a trickle of water. The prints smear. You follow the stream bed, boots filling with cold, and your inner voice tries out a light Sleepy, medieval stealth tutorial, step 1. Ruin your socks. And it's so ridiculous you almost smile in spite of yourself. The boy in the party snorts, grateful for the tiny valve release. Water sliding over rock does its old work of erasing. After 20 paces, the prints return. The father's heels clotted with silt. At a wayside cross, a squat stone with arms more like stubs, the party halts. Such crosses freckle old roads, part map pin, part prayer pole. On the base, you find crumbs of rye bread pressed into the moss, and beside them, a pinch of salt. A woman crosses herself. "Offering," she whispers, the word shivering. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some travelers left bread and salt at crosses for luck, or to ask the saint whose name nobody remembers to smooth the road. If he's leaving offerings, he isn't only running, he's negotiating with the unseen. You glance at the father's tracks circling once around the stone. Did he pace while deciding whether to turn for the city road or the forest cart track? The circle in the dirt looks like hesitation spun into geometry. You find the daughter again, where ivy kisses the stone. 2 small prints pointing away from the cross, apart from his stride, before the narrow drag of a hem scuffs them into the path of his boots. The Reeve's jaw tightens. The village doesn't speak the thought aloud. You press your palm against cool granite and focus instead on what the ground will let you say. She pauses, turns aside, perhaps to look at a track exit that leads homeward. Then the hem marks return, stitched back into his route. Beyond the cross, a hedge break carries signs of a deliberate squeeze-through. Bramble tips are crushed, not hacked, leaving green bruises. Inside, in the small hollow of a rabbit scrape, lies a pilgrim badge, pewter, crudely cast. A tiny scallop with ridges like a child scratched them with a nail. St. James? Someone hazards, thinking of Compostela and seas far away. But badges copied styles. This could be local, a saint of a nearby priory. The important thing isn't the exact saint. It's the idea lodged in the metal. Sanctuary, shrines, the map of Europe strung with places where fugitives believed altars could cast a legal shadow. That's your solid historical fact. In much of medieval Europe, churches and some sanctuaries offered temporary protection, right of sanctuary, for accused persons who reached them, a time to negotiate or confess. Historians still argue whether sanctuary truly shielded those accused of family crimes like abduction, or if communities and officials simply ignored the privilege when passions ran hot. You lift the badge by its bent pin, dropped in a scramble, planted to mislead, or carried as talisman and abandoned when its comfort turned heavy as a stone. By mid-morning, the lane elbows toward the old packhorse bridge, only 2 planks and a prayer. On the far side, you find 3 pebbles, stacked like a tiny cairn. The boy gasps, "Trail sign," and then blushes at his own excitement. Was this a message they left each other when separated for a moment? Or your eyes making a pattern where chance piled its own? You set the top pebble aside, not to break a code, but to mark that you've been here. A quiet handshake with the past. In a rutted place, the father's left footprint deepens more than before. The miller crouches, measuring with his palm. "Blister," he says. His weight leans off the toes. Someone produces a clove of garlic. Of course someone does. And suggests The old trick of rubbing it inside a shoe for relief. That's your odd tidbit for today. Country folk swore by garlic for everything from warding illness to easing feet. If the father knew the trick, he didn't stop to try it. You exhale a thread of humor. Medieval pharmacy, aisle 1, garlic, aisle 2, more garlic. It wins a few grateful grins. In the shade of an elm, you catch a glint. A small wooden token stamped with a mill's mark, the kind used to track whose grain is whose. Not the local mark. The miller says it's from the next parish over, closer to the city road. That points, like an arrow, city. If you're a man marked by a village, you might think a city will wash your name away in its river of faces. He could be angling for the market gate, where hired rooms and news stories sprout like weeds. Historians still argue whether medieval fugitives usually fled to towns because of better hiding, or because guilds and charters offered legal wriggle room. Either way, the token hums with intent. One more thing the lane gives you, unasked. On a smear of damp clay, a faint line like someone dragged a twig while walking. But touch it, and the clay darkens on your finger. A bit of spun thread, brown with grime, hair thin. Spinners know what they're seeing before you do. Flax thread, the kind you twist without thinking when nervous. The woman who recognized the girl's knot inhales sharply. She does that, she says softly. She twirls the spindle's tail when she's thinking. You imagine her moving, mind casting lines even while her feet follow another's plan. The image lands with more weight than the footprint did. Past noon, the holloway climbs and thins. The reeve marks the place where the lane splinters, left to the cattle drift, right to the toll path that will, by a braid of tracks, end at the city's outer fields. You gather the discovered pieces, the beeswax crumb, the tally half, the knot cord, the pilgrim badge, the mill token, the thread like a spider's breath, and hold them up to the light of ordinary sense. This isn't a panicked flight. It's a ledger walk. Steps counted. Offerings made. Choices stacked like pebbles. Cityward. Maybe sanctuary. Maybe a market crowd to swallow a name. And threaded through. Signs of a daughter who marks, knots, twirls. Leaving a map in code only those who know her can read. On the way back down to the party, you let the gentle sarcasm loosen enough to keep the air from cracking. If this were a detective tale, we'd dust for fingerprints and call it lunch. The reeve stares at you blankly at the word fingerprints, then shrugs. We'll settle for footprints and breadcrumbs, he says. And for once, the metaphor is literal enough to make everyone's mouth twitch. You can feel sleep tugging at the edges of the day, an ASMR hush in the rustle of ivy. But the trail keeps its whisper. Not yet. A little farther. There's more to read. You step carefully back onto the narrowing track, the day sliding toward dusk once more. The air grows thick with the smell of pine resin, sharp enough to sting your nose, and the forest feels like it's closing its teeth around you. For hours, you've traced the father's determined footprints, but here, at the crest of a ridge, you pause. Because suddenly, it isn't his stride you notice, it's hers. The lighter steps appear in the mud again, bunched close together, then darting slightly sideways as if she hesitated or even pulled away. The marks are shallow but nervous, as though each toe dug in before committing. You crouch and trace them with your fingertip, heart tapping in rhythm. The reeve mutters, "She fights him." His tone is blunt, but you know better than to carve certainty from soft earth. Historians still argue whether medieval chroniclers were too eager to imagine struggle in abduction tales, using it as a neat proof of innocence or resistance, when the real experiences of girls were tangled in mirror, obedience, and faint hope. Still, you stare at the ground and can almost see her, shoulders tense, eyes wide, breath catching, as she slows her pace to signal, "I do not want this road." You imagine her in that moment. Perhaps she whispers under her breath, not daring to shout, hoping that the trees themselves might carry her plea. In this period, many believed forests were alive with spirits who could shelter or betray wanderers. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, travelers tied scraps of cloth to trees as offerings, believing dryads or saints in hiding would watch over them. Did she glance at a branch and think of leaving her ribbon, only to have it torn from her hand? The farther you go, the more signs appear. Not grand ones, but little scratches in the tail. A shallow heel mark where she seems to have tripped, leaving her father's print dug deeper beside it. A scuff on bark, low down, as though someone's sleeve or shoulder brushed hard while being pulled. And in one patch of softer soil, two impressions overlap strangely. His foot over hers, heavy enough to blur the lines. You swallow, letting the silence stretch around you. The group of searchers stirs uneasily. A farmer whispers, "She's quiet now." He doesn't mean her voice. He means her prints. They've begun to vanish more often, swallowed by the path or hidden behind his weight. It's as if her presence is being erased step by step. That thought chills you more than the damp air clinging to your cloak. You pause and draw in a long breath of earth and moss. Somewhere within this stillness, the girl herself must be shaping her own inner script. Fear, yes, but maybe a flicker of cunning. Medieval tales sometimes portray daughters as helpless lambs, but folklore also hid stories of clever girls who dropped tokens to be found: shoes, beads, even apple cores. You remember the earlier knot of cord discovered on the trail. Perhaps that was her signal, a breadcrumb in a forest too greedy to hold them for long. In the hush of the trees, you let a wry murmur slip out. Hansel and Gretel could have used better boots. The boy in the party grins, though he doesn't know the later fairy tale. He just knows the relief of a shared joke in the thicket of dread. Humor, even dark humor, keeps the searchers moving. The reeve signals the group to hush. Everyone leans in. On the bark of a beech tree, there are faint lines carved with something sharp, maybe a nail or knife point. 3 scratches angled downward, like a clumsy letter. The villagers murmur. Could this be her doing? A sign she tried to leave, etched into wood because the soil betrayed her too easily? Or is it nothing but the casual graze of a passing cart driver long before? Historians still argue whether marks on trees cited in medieval cases were authentic signals or the hopeful inventions of later retellings. Either way, the scratches now burn into your eyes like runes. Night begins to press down. Torches flare again, smoke wrapping you in bitter curls. The forest responds with echoes. Every shout bounces back. Every footstep sounds doubled. The daughter's silence, once a whisper in mud, becomes absolute. The searchers tread heavier now, as though the forest itself has conspired to cover her tracks. You feel the weight of her absence settle like a stone in your pocket. And then the strangest discovery. Tucked into the crook of a root lies a strip of woven rush. Thin, but deliberate. It could have been part of a basket, or maybe torn from the floor mats that villagers spread in cottages. You lift it carefully. It smells faintly of smoke, and when the torchlight hits, you see faint singe marks. Someone whispers that she must have carried it from home, a relic of her hearth. Whether dropped or planted, it is the last flicker of her voice you find tonight. The reeve closes his fist around it, grim as stone. The searchers murmur prayers under their breath, clutching rosaries or talismans. A woman presses her hand to her chest, whispering that the girl is still alive, because a relic from home carries protection. That belief is both fragile and fierce, and you cling to it yourself. As you trudge back through the underbrush, torchlight scattering shadows, you realize that the daughter's silence is not emptiness, it's presence. Each absence of footprint, each faint scratch, each scrap of cord or rush is a reminder that she has not vanished entirely. She is still here, resisting in fragments, her story refusing to be smothered. And as you step out of the forest into the night air, the stars cutting holes in the black sky, you can almost hear her footsteps still. Light, hesitant, stubborn, woven under his heavy stride, shaping a rhythm the earth remembers even when people forget. The torches are nearly spent by the time you and the other villagers stagger back into the square. Smoke coils upward, thin and weary, and the reeve orders the party to scatter to their homes. But you linger, because the real thunder is only now beginning. Word has already traveled ahead of you, carried on the breath of those who stayed behind. The manor court is stirring, and with it, the weight of medieval authority. By morning, the constables arrive. 2 men, wearing little more than leather jerkins and iron caps, each carrying staves that look more ceremonial than practical. Still, their presence is enough to hush the village. In this world, authority rarely meant polished knights. It meant local officers sworn to keep the king's peace, backed by the Lord's steward and the looming shadow of royal justice. They gather in the square, unrolling a parchment writ with an exaggerated flourish. Though most onlookers can't read a letter of it, you lean closer, catching the Latin phrases that bind them to their duty. The steward, a thin man with a sharp nose, clears his throat. By order of the manor court, he intones, all able men shall join in hue and cry until the accused is taken. That phrase, hue and cry, is your mainstream fact here. In medieval England and beyond, the community was legally obliged to pursue suspects when a crime was reported, or face fines themselves. This wasn't optional justice. It was compulsory, woven into law as tightly as thatch into a roof. You glance around at the weary searchers from yesterday, now standing straighter under official eyes. They may be farmers and herdsmen, but today they are deputies, their muddy boots suddenly weightier. And yes, you can't help whispering a sleepy aside. Congratulations, you're all cops now, no pension plan included. A few nervous smirks flicker in the crowd. The constables begin their questions. They ask about the last sighting, the candle stub, the tally stick. Each clue is repeated with embellishments, the details sharpening like a blade every time someone retells them. You notice how swiftly evidence mutates in the hands of fear. The ribbon becomes a message of distress, the pilgrim badge a token of guilt. Historians still argue whether medieval courts truly weighed physical proof or leaned instead on rumor, oath, and communal opinion. What you see now suggests the latter. Justice braided from stories as much as from facts. The steward listens, lips pursed. He announces that if the father is caught, he will be held until the Lord returns from his circuit. That could mean weeks. In the meantime, the villagers must guard the roads, search the woods, and report any whisper of his presence. The threat is clear. Failure to do so will bring fines on the whole community. Fear of money loss sometimes bites sharper than fear of sin. One quirky tidbit the constables mention: in some towns, they'd post a description of a fugitive on the church door. Not with a portrait, of course, but with a list of odd habits or marks. Walks with a limp, favors the left hand, mutters when counting coins. In a world without photographs, reputation itself became the wanted poster. The steward considers doing the same here. You imagine villagers squinting at the notice, then gossiping that anyone who sneezed too oddly might be the fugitive in disguise. The constables also bring manacles, clunky iron cuffs that clink like ominous bells when they set them on the church steps. Children gape at the sight. For them, it's like seeing a monster's jaw laid open in daylight. The message is deliberate. This is what awaits the father. As the assembly drags on, the priest adds his voice, demanding that the girl, when found, be brought first to the church for purification prayers. The notion makes you bristle. She is the one wronged, yet ritual will treat her as tainted. That is another harsh truth of the age. Victims often bore the heavier stigma. Historians still argue whether these rites were meant as comfort, cleansing, or quiet punishment in disguise. Whatever the intent, the effect is plain. Her future will be shadowed even after she is found. The steward orders watchmen on the village gates, rough logs dragged across the road, guarded by men who will share shifts through the night. You catch yourself whispering a joke to ease the tension. Medieval neighborhood watch. Bring your own torch. A weary woman chuckles, clutching her shawl tighter. Humor is still the only thing keeping the air from cracking. By dusk, the authority of manor and crown feels heavier than the mist settling over the fields. The villagers disperse, muttering about fines and duty. The constables sit by the tavern hearth, their staves leaning against the wall, more symbols than weapons. And you, moving among them, feel the net of law pulling tighter, not only around the fugitive father, but around everyone, binding the village into a single body responsible for chasing its own wound. As you lie back on a rough bench that night, the sounds of the square echoing in your ears, you realize that medieval justice was less about catching one man than about proving the community itself was intact. The hue and cry, the manacles, the writ, all of it was theater as much as pursuit. And somewhere out there, in forest or city, the father and daughter walk on, unaware that an entire village now marches behind them in spirit, every rumor sharpened into accusation, every torch lit against the dark. By the time the third dawn finds you, the village has shifted from searching to sentencing, at least in the theater of imagination. People gather in knotted clusters under the elm, rehearsing punishments as if the mere naming of them could tug the fugitive home by the scruff. You move from knot to knot, catching fragments. Stocks, says one woman, with the practical certainty of someone who knows exactly where the bench sits and how many splinters it offers. Pillory, says a miller, eyes glittering. Public shame for a public wound. The gallows, breathes an older man, and the word hangs in the air like a bell that refuses to stop. You feel the temperature drop a degree, and not because the wind has shifted. Medieval penalties are not tidy footnotes, they're weather. Stocks mean hours or days with ankles pinned and calves cramping while neighbors pass judgments with their eyes, and sometimes with rotten eggs. The pillory is worse because the face is pinned, and faces carry stories away from courts faster than parchment. A single afternoon can brand a man in memory for decades. You picture the father's head and hands through the wooden frame, and you can almost hear the small jokes forming in the crowd. At least he can't count his coins now, someone mutters. The village still remembering lips testing silver. The reeve lays out options more formally, pacing a muddy rectangle into an invisible courtroom. Fine and amercement, he begins. Money paid to the Lord or the king's peace. Then spirits darken. Whipping at the cart's tail, says a constable, and people flinch because even speaking the image hurts. Pillory for the day market, stocks by the green, outlawry if he will not answer the court, and, said almost softly, as if the syllables might bite, hanging if felony is proved. You murmur to yourself the mainstream fact you've absorbed from a dozen church porches and manor benches. By the later 13th century in England, statutes tightened penalties for abduction. Raptus had become a serious secular offense, not merely a private wrong to be bartered away. Yet, you add under your breath, historians still argue whether cases like a father taking his own child were treated as full felony in practice or slid sideways into manorial fines and parish hush. In the space between letter and life, entire fates turn. A baker, yes, the same one who once praised punctuality as kindness, lifts her flour-dusted hands. Stocks humiliate, she says, but humiliation is not the same as protection. She's thinking of the daughter, and so are you. Punishing him must not become the village's only poem. The priest, hovering at the edge of the gathering, adds a different note. Penance. Barefoot procession. A pilgrimage assigned by confessor's voice to a shrine far enough to bruise the soul into honesty. That's your quirky tidbit ready to hand. Medieval people often believed certain shrines cured moral diseases as surely as physical ones. A man might be told to walk to Walsingham or Compostela and back, counting prayers as if they were steps on a ladder. You can't resist a quiet callback. Remember the father who said, "Hours are rungs." Somewhere, a confessor is ready to swap his hours for miles. The constables, less poetic, discuss sanctuary and abjuration, the legal path if he were to dash into a church and grip the altar. Here, the mainstream fact is flint clear. A fugitive who claimed sanctuary could, after a set number of days, confess and abjure the realm, swearing to leave the kingdom by a named road and port, never to return without license. You picture the father barefoot on the highway, a cross sewn to his cloak, trudging under watch to the sea's edge. Exile as sentence and story. Historians still argue whether abjuration was mercy or just a neater way to export trouble, you murmur, and a few heads tilt, as if the thought has pushed a cold finger down their spines. Someone suggests a brand to mark him. Another shakes his head. That's talk for other centuries and other crowns. The confusion reminds you to tread carefully with what belongs precisely now. Safer ground lies under the pillory's plank and the sheriff's rope. They're grim, but local. A weaver wonders aloud about cutting hair as shame. Women know that humiliation well, though not for this crime. A farmer, jaw tight, proposes a circuit of the village with a rope around his neck, a perambulation of disgrace. The notion lands hard. Public shaming isn't just punishment here, it's social glue drizzled with vinegar. It shows the world that the village polices itself, that the bonds hold. Your own thoughts skitter to the edges of law. Benefit of clergy, the so-called neck verse, that odd gap where literacy could pivot a sentence from gallows to penance. It's a fringe tidbit with real teeth. If an accused man could read Psalm 51, Miserere me Deus, some courts would treat him as clergy and spare his neck once. Cue your soft joke. Study your Latin, kids. In the Middle Ages, it's more than a resume booster. The nearest schoolboy blinks, uncomprehending of resume, but he laughs at your tone anyway. Would the father know the verse? Likely not. He measured candles by taste and steps by ruts. His books were tallies and horizons. A murmured practicality threads through the crowd. Fines fill coffers, hangings empty fields. The Lord Steward, face pinched like a purse, listens keenly when coin is mentioned. If he's hanged, someone says, who pays the arrears on his strip of land? Who tends the oxen? You hear the gray logic beneath the red suggestion. Justice must be paid for by someone. Stocks cost less than rope, an old man mutters, and you have to bite down on the chuckle that wants to escape. It's a dreadful calculus, and a very medieval one. The priest draws a line with his hand. Remember the daughter. Silence settles like ash. Punishment must teach the village to guard the weak. Heads nod. Yet the priest's next words sour your stomach. And the girl must be purified. Weary anger surges in you at the old reflex that treats harm as stain on the harmed. Historians still argue whether such rites offered comfort or carved blame into ritual. You say softly, and a woman at your elbow squeezes your sleeve in agreement. If there is any sentence to dream tonight, it should be one that speaks for her future rather than staging his ending. You find yourself whispering, stocks to break his pride, yes, alms for her dowry after. A few neighbors turn at that. Penalty turned into a plank for her to step on when she can walk free. By afternoon, the talk curdles into certainty. The steward drafts a presentment for the 100 court. Formal accusation launched along the channels that braid manor and crown. The constables oil the pillory's hinges so it won't stick at the dramatic moment. Your small, sleepy joke, nothing worse than a squeaky moral lesson. It wins the tiniest smile from the alewife who remembers coin touched to lips. Boys are warned that throwing stones at the pilloried man will earn them their own hour on the bench. Girls are told to stay indoors on the day, so, naturally, they begin planning which shutters offer the best view. And still, as the village rehearses punishments like lines in a play, you can't shake the sense that none of it is inevitable. If he's seized in a parish that leans toward negotiation, coin could change hands, oaths could be sworn, and the matter could slide into the ledger as settled. If he reaches a city gate, A guild hall might swallow the case in procedures you can't see from here. Law is a road with forks, and each fork is guarded by men with moods. The certainty people crave is mostly a torch held up to fog. So you stand in the square while evening filters through rafters and thatch, listening to stocks and pillory, exile and rope, penance and coin swirl around you like smoke. You let the talk pass through you and settle on one anchored thought. Whatever the court chooses, the real lesson the village wants to write is about edges. How far a father may reach, how tightly a community closes ranks, what it will do to stitch the torn place back into cloth. You touch the memory of a beeswax crumb, a tally notch, a pilgrim badge. You think of a girl's knot, a twist of thread, a strip of rush. Punishments carve the story's ending into wood and air, but her small signs, stubborn and human, are the lines you refuse to let the crowd forget. The air in the square has turned heavier than smoke, and though the reeve has dismissed the crowd, people linger in clusters like sheep refusing to leave a pen. Tonight, the talk has shifted from the father's fate to something subtler, crueler, and perhaps more dangerous: the weight of honor. In a medieval village, crime was never just crime. It was a stone tossed into a pond, ripples spreading through family reputations and binding threads of kinship. You find yourself drawn into the swirl, listening as neighbors debate who truly carries the shame. A woman, clutching her apron, shakes her head. The girl will never find a good match now. Her words drop like frost onto the gathering. Around her, others nod grimly. That is the logic of the time. If a daughter has been stolen, even unwillingly, suspicion clings to her like soot. Historians still argue whether communities use this stigma to enforce silence, discouraging families from reporting abductions to avoid ruining a girl's marriage prospects. In theory, canon law said a girl wronged against her will was blameless. In practice, whispers often outweighed parchment. The father's brother speaks up, face flushed. "Do not blacken her name. This is his crime." His voice quavers with both rage and helplessness. Yet even he cannot undo the murmurs already weaving around her absence. You can almost feel the girl being tugged in two directions, pitied as a victim, suspected as a participant. It's a cruel paradox, and you realize that medieval justice often doubled the injury by layering shame onto the injured. Near the tavern wall, two young men mutter that if she ever returns, she'll bring bad luck to any household she enters. One spits for emphasis. You glance at the ground, remembering the girl's light footprints scuffed beside her father's heavy stride. If only those marks could speak louder than venomous tongues. But words, in this age, are heavy stones. They sink reputations swiftly. Your mind drifts to a quirky tidbit. Some villages tried to restore honor by ritual. A girl might be led to the church door with family and neighbors, presented as clean through public prayer, almost like a reversed excommunication. But such ceremonies were double-edged. They announced her purity while reminding everyone of the scandal. You murmur the thought softly, and a woman nearby sighs. "Perhaps that is mercy," she says, though her eyes tell you she doesn't believe it. The priest steps forward into the discussion, lifting his hands. "The stain is his," he insists. But the wound bleeds onto us all. His words strike both directions, comfort and curse. If the girl carries shame, then the village too feels tarnished. If the father is punished, it is the community that heals. This collective sense of honor is your mainstream fact. In much of medieval Europe, a crime was not only an offense against an individual, but against the whole group. That is why fines often went to lords and kings rather than to victims. Law itself assumed the community had been wronged. The Reeve adds his voice, practical as ever. If she returns, we will find her a place. But others exchange glances. Place? Yes. But what kind? A servant in another household? A distant marriage brokered in haste? You sense how fragile her future is. The crime was not only an abduction, it was the theft of her expected life. Historians still argue whether women in such situations ever truly rebuilt their reputations or whether they lingered on the margins, tolerated but never fully trusted. In chronicles, some vanish from the record altogether, absorbed into silence. You shiver at the thought of her voice lost like a candle stub ground into mud. To ease the tension, you let slip a quiet, sardonic note. If honor were bread, this village would be starving. A few chuckles break the gloom. Humor may not heal, but it reminds people they can still breathe. The conversation turns harsher again. An older woman, gray hair wrapped in a kerchief, declares, "Her mother should have watched her closer." Gasps ripple. Blame has shifted yet again. In the medieval imagination, the household is a net, and if one knot slips, all are at fault. It's another cruelty. A mother burdened with grief is also accused of negligence. You imagine her sitting by the hearth, staring at the empty spot where her daughter once spun flax, and you feel the sting of injustice twice over. Yet not all voices condemn. A young shepherd protests, "I saw her feed the geese by the mill. She laughed that morning. She did not choose this." His defense is simple, but it glows in the gathering like a coal, refusing to die. Perhaps memory of her ordinary kindness can hold back the tide of suspicion. Perhaps, as the night deepens, the debates grow quieter, more venomous, whispered at doorways. You drift past and hear fragments. What dowry is left? What husband would take her? Will the priest let her sing in the choir again? It's astonishing how quickly a living girl becomes an abstract question, a vessel for anxiety rather than a person. You clench your cloak tighter, feeling the cold of it, and still, somewhere out there, she walks beside the man who took her, leaving faint scratches on bark and threads in the mud. Her body is present, her will still flickering. But here, in the village she's left, her absence is already being turned into judgment. Her future debated like grain at market. When you finally lie down in your own corner of the tavern loft, the straw prickling your back, you hear the faint murmur of villagers below still arguing. Stocks or gallows? Purity or stain? Family honor or community shame? The questions tumble endlessly, and in their echo, you realize the deeper truth. Medieval justice wasn't only about punishing criminals. It was about policing stories, deciding who carried shame, who was cleansed, who could walk the lanes without eyes burning into their back. You close your eyes, but the whispers cling like smoke. The girl's life has already been rewritten by tongues that never asked her for a single word. The story refuses to stay in one village. By the time another market day dawns, word of the abduction has slithered across hedgerows and manor boundaries, carried in wagons, on the tongues of peddlers, and in the songs of men with lutes who never met the girl but already know her tale by heart. You wander down the market road with villagers, the smell of onions and wet wool thick in the air, and you hear it before you see it, a ballad being born. Near the stone cross, a traveling troubadour plucks at a stringed instrument patched more than polished. His voice rings clear. A father took what was not his, and shadows closed behind him. The rhyme is rough, but the crowd is enchanted. This is how legend begins, not with parchment ink, but with tune and repetition. You can almost see the crime dissolving into metaphor, even as people nod along. This is your mainstream fact. Medieval Europe was an oral culture as much as a written one, and stories of crime often spread through verse long before clerks inscribed them. Troubadours and minstrels embroidered reality, adding wolves where there were none, painting daughters as radiant saints or tragic waifs. The truth bent itself into rhyme, and rhyme traveled faster than any horse. Historians still argue whether such songs should be read as sources of fact or as mirrors of collective fear. Either way, they shaped how crimes were remembered. You linger by the crowd. Children hum the refrain, tugging at their mother's skirts. A farmer repeats a verse later at his stall, misquoting it, and suddenly a new version is seeded. You feel the tale expanding, like yeast in warm dough. What was once one family's nightmare is now a market day entertainment, traded for coins and laughter. The quirky tidbit you recall fits perfectly here. Some minstrels carried song scrolls, crude woodcuts, or written prompts to help remember long ballads. A few even sold illustrated broadsides to wealthier patrons. Imagine, you whisper, the girl's face reduced to a carved sketch passed from hand to hand. Your stomach knots at the thought, but you admit softly, once a story grows legs, nobody can corral where it runs. You drift past stalls selling salted fish, honeycombs, and rough pottery. Over and over, you hear the tale reshaped. One man insists the father was bewitched by a forest spirit. Another says greed drove him. He meant to sell the girl in the city like cattle. Another lowers his voice. No, it was prophecy. His candle stub was a charm against fate. You shake your head, half in dismay, half in sleepy amusement. If conspiracy theories had been a guild, you mutter, they'd have run half the markets by now. A passing peddler laughs without even knowing why. Soon you find a friar outside the alehouse, preaching that the crime proves the world is ending. He waves a cracked Bible, booming that fathers betraying daughters are signs of revelation. People shudder and nod. You notice how readily human tragedy becomes divine allegory, and you wonder, when the girl is finally found, will she still be herself? Or only a symbol pinned to someone's sermon? Historians still argue whether medieval people distinguished clearly between news and legend, or whether every story quickly slid into a shared pool where fact mattered less than lesson. Standing here, you suspect the latter. To the crowd, the details you painstakingly tracked The beeswax crumb, the tally stick, the knot of cord are already gone. In their place are wolves, demons, omens, and songs. At one stall, an old woman chants a rhyme to sell herbs. Drink this tea, no man will stray. Father's sins will fade away. It's marketing by myth, and you almost laugh at the ingenuity. Even commerce is absorbing the tale, twisting tragedy into product. As twilight deepens, the troubadour's song circles back to its refrain. You hear the villagers humming, their voices weaving with his, and you realize something unsettling. The father may not yet have been caught, but he's already been captured by story. And the daughter, too, is being rewritten into a figure she never chose. Saint, victim, omen, rhyme. You leave the market with the tune stuck in your head, a rhythm too insistent to ignore. The road feels heavier now, as though every footprint you traced has been paved over with melody. And in a soft, sardonic whisper, you tell yourself, medieval true crime podcasts, brought to you by The Loot. A boy walking beside you giggles without knowing what a podcast is. But he likes the word's shape. Back at the village, torches flicker in the square. You hear neighbors already retelling the new verses they picked up in town. Tomorrow, those verses will change again, and the day after, again. The story is no longer theirs to control. It has joined the endless current of medieval legend, a stream where truth and invention float side by side. You push open a door that wasn't here a moment ago. Oak dark as midnight, hinges sighing, and find yourself in a cool room where light falls like water. Shelves shoulder the walls. Parchment slumbers in bundles tied with faded ribbon. Somewhere, a quill scratches. Centuries have spun past the village, but you are still in the same story. Only now, you're in the place where stories are fossilized, the archive. You breathe in dust and hide glue and a whiff of beeswax polish. Oddly familiar, like the candle crumb you once lifted from mud. Welcome to the library, you whisper to yourself, where crimes retire to paperwork. It's a sleepy joke, but the clerk at the table gives you a look that says he's heard worse. You lean over a roll of parchment, the skin thin enough to show veins of the animal it once wrapped. On the outer fold, a clerk's neat Latin hand names a year you could never pronounce in the village square. Inside, presentments, fines, oaths, raptus. The word crops up like briars across lines, its meanings braided. Abduction, seizure, sometimes worse. Your finger hovers, careful not to touch. Historians still argue whether medieval clerks used raptus precisely or loosely, and whether later readers, that's you, and everyone like you, misread the word into a drama it didn't always carry. The ambiguity feels like a fog that never clears, only shifts in color. You turn a page in your mind and step to a different table. Royal plea rolls, the common law's long memory. Here the voices are colder. The Lord Steward complains. The sheriff reports a failure of pursuit. The constables' names appear where yours once trekked through mud with torches. A simple, harsh line. He took and carried off his daughter. No adjectives, no candle stubs, or knots of cord. Bureaucracy declaws details. You miss the forest immediately. Still, motive slinks between the lines. Greed is the easiest to imagine. In a world where a daughter might bring maritagium, a marriage portion, her body is a lever to pry loose debt. That's your mainstream fact for the table. Marriage and wardship rights were marketable assets in medieval society, and the guardianship of an heiress could be worth real coin. If a father feared losing control of property, he might seize the asset before others did. Cold words, but parchment prefers cold. You swallow, wishing you could stuff the language back into its box. Control offers a second motive. You remember the father's exact change and his habit of touching coins to his lips. A man who needs each unit to behave might need people to behave too. The tally stick you found returns to your palm. Debt is more than money. It's a way of believing the world owes you obedience. Historians still argue whether patriarchal authority alone explains cases like this, or whether we too easily press modern diagnoses onto medieval men. Was he a tyrant by custom, or a frightened planner whose fear hardened into command? Madness? The hardest card to play across centuries. Chroniclers sometimes call it melancholy, a black bile of the soul. You glance at a medical miscellany open on a side desk, its recipes marching like an army of hope against the dark. For sadness of the heart, it suggests, take rosemary and rue. You could make a gentle joke, anxiety tea, 14th century blend, but you say it only in your head because the room feels like a chapel. If he was unwell, parchment will not confess it. Rolls record acts, not tremors. Historians still argue whether medieval legal records flatten complicated minds into simple villains, and whether ballads inflate them into monsters. Between those poles, a person is hard to find. The clerk at the next table beckons you to a book that once lived in a priory, its margins alive with doodles, rabbits jousting with knights, a snail menacing a soldier. There, in a corner, a note in quick, impatient hand. A daughter carried off in the next parish, bells rung. It's only a flicker, but your heart lifts. Monks wrote jokes, drew snails, and jotted local scandals in the gutters of theology. That's your quirky tidbit. Those famous marginalia, snails, long-eared beasts, men wrestling, often share space with the news of the day, as if the scribe couldn't help peeking out the window while copying eternity. The combination makes you smile. Our case wedged between a psalm and a snail, like life between Sunday and Monday. You read other voices. A moralist thunders in a sermon collection that fathers who steal their own fruit will reap famine. A confessor's handbook advises penance scaled by distance. 30 miles barefoot for a forced taking, more if cruelty followed. A city ordinance warns innkeepers against sheltering men with strange silence. Silence itself is suspicious here. You remember the father's tight jaw, the bark of the blacksmith's warning. Each text is a shard. You cup them carefully, wary of cutting yourself on certainty. Then there are the ballads. You find a scrap of verse copied decades later, probably from a singer who wanted to fix a tune before it drifted. He walked by the moon with a candle's small heart, the line says, counting the rungs that had no end. Your throat tightens at the callback, unbidden, his hours as rungs, his candle as metronome. But in the next stanza, the daughter becomes a saint whose footprints bloom into lilies. You exhale. Poetry is not a camera. It's a mirror that flatters its own fear. Historians still argue whether we should mine such verses for clues or leave them as weather reports of feeling. Your fingers itch to visit the church where a sanctuary roll might hold his name, or A wardship account might list a fine that settled everything into ledger calm. The clerk mentions, with a shrug, that some rolls were recycled, scraped, washed, and written over. Palimpsest. The very word feels like a tide pulling secrets off sand. Scholars today coax erased ink to reappear with ultraviolet light. The ghost of a sentence rises like breath on a mirror. You think of the daughter's light footprints and wonder which is harder to recover, a blurred track in mud or a scraped line on calfskin. Archival cardio, you murmur, flexing cramped shoulders. The clerk smiles for the first time. He has felt it too. The ache that comes of chasing a life across unreliable furniture. You drift to another corner, a manorial account with a bland note. Immersements, collected for default of pursuit. The village paid for not running hard enough. Law has a way of billing pain to the nearest wallet. That memory stings. You see again the boy with the makeshift headband and the woman with the rolling pin. They did run. But parchment calculates differently. If the audit could wear a face, you think, it would be a purse with eyebrows. The joke helps the bitterness go down. Greed, control, madness, 3 doors, none opening cleanly. Add a fourth, fear. Perhaps he feared a betrothal that would split the household. Perhaps he feared the Lord's claim on an heiress's marriage. Perhaps he feared his own aging hands and the way time refused to be counted into obedience. Historians still argue whether terror of downward slide, hunger, loss of land, shame, fueled more medieval crimes than malice did. A man with too many tallies and not enough candles might clutch at the only thing he thinks he can still command: company on a road that scares him. You close one roll, then another. The scribe's Latin keeps its secrets. The ballad keeps its rhymes. The sermon keeps its thunder. When you step back into the corridor, daylight feels new-made. Motives, you realize, are temptations of the tidy mind. The village wanted a villain. The ballad wanted a warning. The court wanted a category. You want, embarrassingly, a neat moral. Greed, madness, control. Pick one and sleep. But the story you've been walking refuses simplification. It leaves you with a handful of objects: beeswax, tally, knot, badge, thread, and a shadow that doesn't align with any single face. As you reach for the door, you pause and let a last small piece of sarcasm slip out under your breath. If only the archive checked out motives like books. The air declines to laugh. It knows better. You step back into the living world, where fields change green, bells still ring, and the girl, remember her, begins to shape a future that can't be penciled into someone else's margin. The clerks keep their lines. You keep walking. And the question of why stays with you the way beeswax clings under a fingernail. Subtle, stubborn, a scent you can't quite wash away. You hear it first in the creak of the gate rather than in any trumpet. She is back. No procession, no ballad, just a thin figure at the edge of the green. Hem dusty, braid loose, eyes like river stones after rain. You find yourself walking toward her before you decide to move. And when you reach her, you do not ask questions. You take the weight of her basket, light as a lie, and steer her gently toward the church steps, where the priest is already fumbling with a small pewter sprinkler and words that feel larger than his throat. He murmurs a blessing. Not the hard thunder of denunciation you heard on that frantic night, but a quieter Latin stitched from psalms of deliverance. It is not exactly a rite with a name. In villages like this, prayer is patched from whatever cloth is at hand. That's a plain historical fact. Medieval churching rites existed for women after childbirth, but for captives who returned, communities often improvised prayers of thanksgiving or cleansing, blending custom with conscience. Whether that soothed or shamed, historians still argue. You watch her accept the drops of water on her brow the way a parched leaf accepts dew, without ceremony, without complaint. Outside, the square holds its breath, then exhales in a shuffle of feet and 100 small hesitations. A girl mocked for bad luck yesterday needs a path today. The reeve, awkward as a man in a borrowed tunic, announces that the parish alms chest, iron-banded, 3-locked, opened only when all key holders meet, will be used to ease her start. Another solid fact: such chests existed in many parishes and guilds, triple-locked, to prevent one greedy hand from taking the lot. Coins clink into a wooden bowl. Not many, but enough to sound like hope. You let a gentle joke drift under your breath. The Village GoFundMe, medieval edition. And even the steward's mouth twitches before he remembers he is the steward. She does not speak much. When she does, her voice is hoarse, as if she's been walking with a stone tucked under her tongue. You do not press. Instead, you walk beside her to the baker's house, where warm air sighs out of the doorway like a friendly dog. The baker, who once lectured the square on the difference between humiliation and protection, has already set aside a straw mattress near the oven for heat. A few weeks, she says, then we'll see. A few weeks is sometimes what a life needs to begin again. The women of the lane conduct a quiet repair. One brings a comb, another a length of linen, a third a sprig of rosemary tucked into the seam of a sleeve, an old charm for clear thoughts. That's your quirky tidbit dangling like a green smile. People in this age sometimes stitched herbs into clothing, not just for scent, but for protection of mind and memory. A shepherd boy arrives late and shy, pressing a smooth stone with a natural hole through its center into her palm. A hagstone, he stammers. If you peer through the hole, nightmares stay small. She thanks him with a look you will remember when you forget every verse of the market ballad. She sleeps. The first night is full of clattering dreams, ovens for giants, bells that run instead of ring. The second is quieter. On the third, she rises before dawn and puts her hands to work. Spinning, first, flax into thread, twist by twist, the muscle memory as steady as breath. Then kneading, heel of the palm into dough, fold and turn, until the rhythm writes itself into her bones. When the oven opens, she leans into the heat without flinching, cheeks flushed warm instead of wild. Baker's spa day, you murmur, letting the sleepy sarcasm lighten the steam. And the alewife across the lane snorts hard enough to fog her jug. A week in, you walk with her to the well. People practice their courage on the way to water. It's where gossip goes to convert into apology. A woman who once said the girl would carry bad luck brings a lopsided cup and mutters that the geese by the mill haven't stopped watching the road. It is as close to "We missed you," as she can manage. Another leaves a little beeswax candle on the well's ledge, the good kind, which burns without sputtering. You remember the crumb you found in the lane and feel the odd comfort of a circle closing. Light leaving, light returning. She pockets the candle without drama. You can tell she intends to light it in a corner where no one will see her cry. The priest asks gently about entering service in a larger household or seeking refuge with sisters in the nearest town. Options multiply when people truly want them to. You walk with her to the edge of that thought. A hospital of St. John near the city takes in travelers, the poor, the sick. Women sometimes serve there as lay sisters, praying, nursing, mending. That's another historical note, squared and true. Medieval hospitals were more like almshouses and guest houses, and laywomen often kept them running. Whether such service gave women unusual independence or simply exchanged one dependence for another, historians still argue. She listens, then shakes her head for now. "Bread first," she says, "then decisions." The next market day is a test. The ballad is there, of course. The troubadour has upgraded a rhyme or two, and so are the whispers, lighter now, but still capable of bruising. You walk at her shoulder, a silent shield with muddy boots. She stops by the stall of a weaver who once bought her family's flax bundles and accepts, without fuss, a spare distaff and spindle. Payment is the spun thread she'll bring next week. This is how dignity works here. Not speeches, not proclamations, but a tool quietly placed in a hand, and the expectation that it will be used. In the afternoon, she goes alone to the church, where the colored light tosses scraps of red and blue across the flagstones. She sets the beeswax candle near the altar and does not ask the priest for words. The flame climbs, sure of itself, the way a good story climbs when you tell only what is yours to tell. You remember the tally stick, too, the notches whose halves had to fit, and think, some debts will never line up in this world, but alms can be transmuted into dowry, and the reeve, bless his practical heart, begins to whisper about that. If enough coin is gathered, if the steward can be nudged, perhaps a small chest and a goat will become a line of tomorrow no one expected last month. Whether communities actually did this when the songs weren't listening, historians still argue, but you have watched them pass bowls, and you are prepared to believe in bowls. Evenings, when the oven cools, she sits at the baker's threshold and knots twine in that double forward, once back pattern you found in the hedge. It is habit, yes, but it is also a language. Children sit at her feet and learn the knot that never slips, and the small symmetry of that nearly undoes you. The shepherd boy peers through his hagstone and swears the street looks brighter. You tell him that's because he cleaned the dirt off, and he declares himself a scientist. Congratulations, you have invented peer review at the village well. Will she marry? Will she choose service in the town hospital? Will she stay and bake until the flour dust whitens her eyebrows like the miller's? You cannot force the future into any mold but hers. She gives you only one clear sign. On your last walk to the edge of the fields, she pulls that pewter pilgrim badge, the little scallop you once found near the hedge break, out of her pocket. Not the same one, of course, but its twin bought for a coin at market. She pins it on the inside of her sleeve, where only she can feel the cool brush of metal. Sanctuary is no longer a place on a map. It is a vow to herself. Go if you must. Stay if you wish. Choose when you can. On the way home, you pass the ash tree, whose roots once reached like fingers into the lane. She stops to lay her palm against the bark, then scratches. Not 3 desperate lines this time, but a tidy mark only you and she will notice, tucked behind a ridge. You do not ask what it means. Some signs are not for the archive. They are for the pulse. And so, when the bells fold the evening into a low hum and the oven sighs itself to sleep, you sit with her in the doorway, 2 silhouettes with flour on their sleeves and smoke in their hair, while the village remembers how to look without staring. The world is still scarred. It always was. But scar is not the same as stop. Tomorrow she will spin. The next day she will bake. After that, well, no prophecy today. You press the hagstone to your eye, see the square ringed in soft circles, and tell yourself a last small jest to ease the breath out of your chest. Medieval wellness plan: bread, sleep, and fewer dramatic road trips. She doesn't laugh aloud, but the corner of her mouth tilts, and that is enough to carry you both through the night. The village square lies quiet, washed in the amber of another dawn. Chickens peck, a smith's hammer sings faintly, and smoke curls gently, as though the world is remembering how to breathe. You stand at the well, watching the surface ripple, and realize that what began as a single act of betrayal has seeped outward into every corner of life. Law, gossip, legend, prayer. And still, the ripples move, stretching into centuries you now glimpse like pages turning. Already the story has changed tone. In the tavern, you overhear a traveler tell it with more flourish than truth. He was cursed by a spirit of the woods. A merchant swears he heard it sung in the next shire as if it were a parable against greed, and a priest, passing through, quotes it as proof that sin can sprout inside any household. The girl's name rarely appears in these retellings. She is the daughter, a symbol, a cipher. But you know her, her knots, her spindle, her quiet strength by the baker's hearth. That's your mainstream fact to anchor here. Many medieval crimes echo into folklore not as precise chronicles, but as moral fables. Outlaws became heroes. Wronged women became saints or shadows. Fathers who failed their duty became bywords for corruption. Whether those tales protected memory or erased individuals, historians still argue. Some say legend preserves a truth deeper than parchment. Others say it buries lived experience beneath rhyme. Still, the echoes multiply. At the next fair, you see a broadsheet pinned by a stall, an illustrated verse of a father with a rope in his hand and a daughter drawn like a saint in a halo of lilies. The woodcut is crude, her face little more than circles and dots, but the message is sharp. The peddler selling it winks, a caution for men who would overreach. You almost laugh softly. Medieval clickbait. It earns you a raised eyebrow, but a boy buys the sheet for a halfpenny anyway. A quirky tidbit falls into your lap when a pilgrim passing through swears that in a shrine miles away, a carving shows a girl with a spindle held like a sword. Pilgrims love to claim local stories as relics. You picture the daughter's habit of twisting thread when nervous, now immortalized in oak or stone as if it were prophecy. Folklore has a way of sharpening gestures into miracles. You sit on the green as evening comes, thinking of how far the story has walked. From footprints in mud to ink on parchment. From torchlit hunts to songs sung under painted beams. It lingers now in multiple forms: crime, caution, confession, entertainment. And each retelling leaves you asking, what remains? The girl's silence? The father's tally of rungs? The community's hunger for closure? Historians still argue whether memory itself is a kind of justice or simply another stage of forgetting. Children run by, chasing each other with sticks, chanting a verse they barely understand. Their laughter is bright, careless, but you flinch at the way words outlive wounds. Perhaps someday her name will vanish, but the rhythm will still beat on. A father took, a daughter fled, flattened into playground rhyme. It's cruel, and yet oddly reassuring. Memory refuses to die, even if it mutates. At night, you walk once more by the church. The bell rope sways slightly in the draft, like a heartbeat too large for one chest. Inside, the daughter's beeswax candle has burned low, leaving a stub on the altar. The wax puddle gleams, gold and stubborn. You think of the first crumb you found in the holloway and realize you have come full circle. Light lost, light found, light remade. You breathe out and let a last, gentle sarcasm slip through the hush. So, lesson learned. Never underestimate a candle's narrative arc. The empty nave doesn't laugh, but it doesn't scold either. When dawn returns, you watch the village move on. The girl spins thread, bakes bread, and lives days that are hers again. The father is still gone, whether caught, punished, exiled, or folded into the mist of ballad, you may never know. And that, too, is part of the lesson. Stories end not with answers, but with endurance. The echo of her footprints remains, lighter than his, but steady enough to guide you home. You've walked through a medieval night thick with bells, gossip, law, and legend. You've stepped in mud where footprints vanished, crouched over scraps of cord, listened to ballads that bent truth into rhyme. Most of all, you felt how a single crime can ripple outward, shaping courts, shaping sermons, shaping songs. And maybe you've realized, too, that what survives isn't the neat ending, but the messy endurance of lives forced to keep going. Here, at the edge of sleep, you hold two images. A father whose tallies ruled him until he ruled too far, and a daughter who, with knots and thread and quiet work, kept her own story alive. She never asked to be legend, but her resilience seeped into the cracks anyway. In a way, that's the truest record of all. Not parchment or song, but persistence. So as your eyes grow heavy, let the torches dim and the bells fade. Picture a beeswax candle guttering, its flame small but steady. Imagine the hush of a village settling back into its rhythm, bread rising, oxen lowing, children laughing with sticks in hand. The crime remains in memory, but the world does not stop. Neither should you. You, too, carry stories that ache and twist, yet still lead you forward. Breathe in, slow. Let go of the mud, the whispers, the gallows rehearsals. Keep only the candle, the spindle, the knot that never slips. And with that, the tale closes its parchment covers.